Hello everybody, thank you so much for being here. I'm really delighted to read with Lisa. Lisa's agent, Bologna, sent me a galley of The Stolen Child over the summer, and once I started to read it, I was absolutely drunk on the novel. I think it's extraordinary, and I'm so glad to be here. And Lisa also came to visit my students at Rutgers last week, so I'm officially stalking her. The theme of tonight's event is sex and obsession. So I think that it was worth braving the weather for. And I'm going to read a section from my novel Tender, which is about obsession. And this section is really the quick of that obsession for the main character, Catherine. She's a student at Trinity College Dublin in the 90s, and James, her closest friend, is a young artist. James is gay and is in the process of coming out, and Catherine has just become completely moved from a close friendship to a deep infatuation with him. And this is the summer of their time together, when thinking about James has become really painful for Catherine. There are a couple of little references in what I'm about to read that I just want to briefly explain. She's, as though things weren't bad enough, Catherine's been working on an essay about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. So that's gotten a little bit into her head. And some of her other friends are mentioned in the section, which is kind of a fragmented section, kind of intended to reflect what the inside of her mind looks like during this time. Okay. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. Was there any line as magnificent? That had been about the newborn Frida, that poem. Frida, who would grow up to send the red and yellow blisters across the cover of her father's book. The children were very cold but quite safe. None of this was any of Catherine's business. Hughes, in Epiphany, his own poem about that same newborn, written that same London spring, described how he had almost bought a baby fox. A man on a bridge had the animal stuffed down his coat front, the tiny face staring out between the lapels. Bereft of the blue milk, the toys of feather and fur, the den life's happy dark, and the huge whisper of the constellations, out of which mother had always returned. Cheap enough at £1, the man with the fox said. But no. Inevitable. What happened between herself and James was inevitable. Was that true? Was that a reality? Was a reality something you arrived at? Or something you made? Or something you just forced onto things? 2. Lovers. As though, what was it Julia Doonan had said? As though the rest of us are only going to Mass together. And now it seemed Catherine and James were lovers, at least in private. At least that was where other people could not see them. And well, at the end of it, all love was private, wasn't it? This was what Catherine told herself. Catherine wanted him every minute. Catherine wanted him to fuck her until she dissolved. James was another story. 3. Once as a small girl, she had gone with the wrong mother from the shop. She had not realized it was the wrong mother. The woman was tall and moved with purpose and wore boots and carried a handbag and had a winter coat. Her mother on that day had also had all of these things. Catherine walked along, chatting and chatting. The woman did not even notice the child at her knee. How could you not even notice? Her mother calling and calling from the door. James laughed at her when she told him that story. James was right to laugh. You knew damn well what you were up to, Riley, he said, stretched out on her bed, smoking. You liked the cut of that other woman's jib. His hand resting on his naked stomach. Yeah, I forgot to mention they're sleeping together. His nipples pink and pricked and hard. His dick, 10 minutes earlier, had kept making her gag, but the throat was where you were meant to take it, wasn't it? The throat was how you had the best chance of getting it again. And anyway, why on earth was she telling him that story now? James had made it happen the second time, Catherine not quite able to believe it. His hands, the way they changed from stroking fondly to stroking slow, his tongue full and supple against hers, the hardness of him, already waiting, already there, and surely that meant something. Surely that said, but no, because the way they got through this, got away with this, was by laughing about it. Their great joke, their great mischief, their great addition to the long, long list of things that together they could do. And afterwards, the slagging, the innuendo, like they were meeting for breakfast after their separate, hilarious one-night stands. You're terrible, Muriel. You're terrible. Where does the blood go when it is making you weak, when it is making you want to fall? Does it go to the brain first, and from there to the cunt, or is it the other way around? Is it the brain or the cunt that says it to you over and over, no matter how you try to reason with it, no matter how you try to roar at it? Is it the brain or the cunt that hisses those words? Hissing, get him, bring him here. His hands, his tongue, the fullness of him tensed and pleading in her hand. His eyes closed, lids the color of sand, packed sand, trodden over. Why did such things come to her mind? And for Catherine, just the touch of him was always enough. Just the fact of him, that this was James. He was a long, low shudder that started deep in her spine. And yes, probably when he put his hand to her there, it should feel different. Yes, probably it should not feel like it felt, like he had lost something down there, like he was searching down there, impatiently casting about. And yes, probably when he put his mouth there, probably he found it, all of that. How would he think of it? Architecture? And was it her fault if he looked to her more beautiful every day? Was it her business? Because it was only a lark, only a plunge. Catherine and James, Catherine and James, and the things they could do. Thank you.
Thank you for. I just have to say that she told part of the story, but while Gráinne was giving Belinda my novel, and she had emailed me and she'd said, there's an Irish writer, Belinda, and I think she likes it. I think she's going to give you a blurb. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, thanks. I was in Ireland and I had just read Tender very quickly and kind of obsessively over a few days. And then I had a friend who had recommended it to me, and then we met at the pub and talked about it for a long time. And I was already obsessed with it, but I didn't connect I knew the book. I didn't connect the name.
She just thought it was another Irish author.
It was just another Irish author.
There's so many of us.
I was like, that's great. And then I went and looked back and I was like, oh. And so when you did blurb, I sent you that email and I was like, it's sex and obsession. And we have a lot to talk about. So we're stalking each other, really. So we both agreed to read something about obsession tonight. So I'm reading something from the middle of the book. Just to give you an introduction, The Stolen Child takes place, it's a remote island off the west coast of Ireland in 1959, which doesn't have any modern conveniences. So even though it's 1959 in the west of Ireland, that's like 1910 maybe. And the characters are, they're two sisters who grow up on the island who are in their 20s. Emer and Rose. Emer has a son, Niall, who's 6, and Rose already has 6 children, even though they're only 23. They're married to brothers, and a woman comes to the island at the beginning, and her name is Bridget, and she's American. She comes to live in her uncle's cottage that he's left her after he died, and she's looking for a well that is rumored to cure infertility. The island is called St. Bridget's Island, and it was originally only occupied by nuns. And the real St. Bridget in history, I changed it so that she had, instead of her convent in Kildare. She had a convent on an island. So when Bridget comes, Emer, who's very sort of grumpy, lonely woman who hates the island and wants to leave, becomes friends with her. And no one wants to tell her where the well is. But as they grow closer and Emer becomes more and more attracted to her, she ends up telling her where it is. And the first time, the scene I'm going to read you is after the first time they actually have sex, and it's right after she shows her the well. It's like she gives her the well, and Bridget kind of knows that Emer's been waiting for something to happen. So, what am I going to read? So the chapter that I'm reading from is going to have a little bit of a flashback, and then a scene between the two of them. When Rose and Emer were 11, there was a young teacher in the island school who taught them about the Druid Bridget alongside the traditional lessons about the saint. The Druids believed that souls radiated around bodies, and when a person found their Anam Cara, soul friend, it meant that both their spirits began to flow together, like two streams meeting to fill a well. The teacher used this metaphor to partner the children up for studying their sums and spelling. Having a soul friend challenged you, she explained, awakened you to yourself so you could accomplish things you wouldn't have been able to do on your own. They could remove what was weighing you down, like the peeling off of drenched clothes. St. Bridget had Darla, and her postulants paired off together, because Bridget was not only a Christian saint. She carried with her stories that were more ancient than Jesus. The girls in the school fell in love with this idea. During their dinner break, they gathered behind the stone wall and reenacted the Druid ceremony of friendship. Girls paired off, wound their shawls around their necks, clasped hands, and recited with the utmost solemnity, "I honor your path, I drink from your well, I bring my unprotected heart to our meeting place." They took water from the school's well and sprinkled on each other's hair and pressed their lips together with the fervor they imagined they would one day kiss boys. Everyone wanted to be Rose's Anam Cara, but since no one wanted to be Emer's, they wouldn't dare hold her hand, and they shuddered at the thought of her chapped, angry mouth. Rose always chose her sister out of loyalty. They didn't kiss or bring much enthusiasm when it was their turn, but there were only 8 girls in the school, and Rose couldn't afford to insult any of them by not playing along. The boys, who were the ones they were practicing for, played football in the field and paid them little mind. The priest, who only got over to St. Bridget's once a month if the weather allowed, sent that teacher packing when word of her irreverent lessons reached him. He was used to island superstition and thought it harmless. He was Irish, after all. But it was one thing to hold on to whispered fireside references to the good people. It was quite another to have a school teacher confusing the Christian saint with a pagan goddess. Rose and Emer were both relieved when he put a stop to it. Rose, because the whole business had seemed a bit sinful all along, and Emer, because watching her classmates tilt toward each other's lips made heat rise so furiously in her throat, she imagined that if anyone dared to kiss her, she would spew fire into their mouths. She despised the lot of them, and she resented that none of them wanted to be her partner. They all wanted Rose, and they blamed her even more for keeping Rose away from them. She thinks of this the first time Bridget kisses her, pushing her back on the ground beside the well and letting the holy water pass into her mouth. She had wanted one of those girls to kiss her, hard enough that it would push away the clog left inside her throat by the fairies. Later, when she watched Rose in the Clochan with Austin, when she saw what followed kissing, she wanted that as well. Now she wonders if St. Bridget and her nuns were devout at all. She imagines them in the Clochans, not only praying and transcribing, but also lifting off their habits and pressing against each other, letting themselves drop away into another woman's mouth. Worship has an entirely different meaning now. So Rose has, who has no idea what's going on between her sister and Bridget, has Bridget over for dinner, and her husband is there and their mother, but Emer's husband, Patch, is off the island. She's not very fond of him. Bridget helps Rose put the children to bed. Oh, well, one other thing I need to tell you is that when Emer was a child, she was kind of stolen by the fairies, but then given back. And it left her with only, she had an infection in one eye, and so she wears a patch over one eye. And because of this incident, she's really afraid that fairies are after her son, who's 7 years old. So she spent most of his life guarding him from these fairies, which they also call the good people. Bridget helps Rose put the children to bed while Emer does the washing up. Austin, which is Rose's husband, sits with his dirty socks up on the table, right in Emer's way. I don't think she's the full shilling, Clodagh says, when Bridget carries a sleeping toddler into the bedroom. Oh, give it a rest, Mammy, Emer says. You can't say a word against Bridget, Austin laughs. Not to Emer, anyways. She's besotted. Emer whacks at his feet with the dishcloth, then turns to hide her blush. Austin chuckles and moves over to the fire to light his pipe. Bridget stays late, and by the time she is ready to leave, Niall has fallen asleep with the older girls in the loft bed. Leave the child here, Emer, Rose says. He's too big to carry anymore. Emer stiffens and hopes that Bridget, across the room, is pausing her breath in the same anticipation. Would you walk Bridget home, Rose says. I'm knackered as it is. Go and help her with the chores we stole her from. Austin looks up at Emer for a second with something other than his usual polite sweep of eyes. He knows, she thinks. He can sense what she and Bridget are about to do, but then his eyes pass over her and fix onto his wife, and that familiar grin creeps up. He has plans of his own. Funny that his smile still hurt her, even though she was looking forward to someone else's mouth. Emer and Bridget leave together. It's September and the sun goes down earlier every day. Soon the darkness will be far longer than the light, but the breeze is mild and the stars and moon are unclothed and the road to Bridget's house appears lit up from within. Emer imagines she can hear within their footsteps an echo of anticipation, the thud and shuffle of lust. This is how Austin and Rose once felt, back when they had to walk to secret places where they could touch each other. Emer recognizes the feeling, though she is still alarmed at whom it is attached to. I thought you were married, Emer says suddenly. Bridget laughs. I was. But you've done this before. Yes, Emer. With women, I mean. I loved my husband, but I had this with women as well, a long time ago. It's a sin, sure, Emer says. So they tell me. Will you leave us now, Emer says, letting this new fear rush forward, fear that swells with the same urgency as her desire. Now that I've shown you the well, I'm not going anywhere. Which man will you get, Emer whispers, to give you the baby? And Bridget kisses her in a way that feels almost angry, but Emer wants this so much that she can't stop to question what emotion is behind it. This time, Emer pushes Bridget onto her back. She does not pause and wonder what to do. She has spent enough time imagining it. She is astonished at Bridget's reactions, delighted that her hands, her mouth, and her body can be so skillful, can pull such violent pleasure out of someone else. Pleasure instead of disgust. And so the rest of the chapter is her trying to escape and leaving her child alone in a way that she's never left him before because she wants time alone with Bridget. There are moments with Bridget, not having to do with lust, but afterwards, lying in the bracken, watching the clouds move, or walking without touching along the cliff edge, Niall and the pig and Bridget's dog bounding ahead of them, where Emer has a foreign feeling. Cupfuls of time where she feels no anxiety or anger or ugliness or regret, where nothing swarms or seizes within her, and all she is aware of is a still, liquid feeling of joy. It's not the same as the joy Niall lends to her, which allows her to forget herself and delight in him. This happiness originates inside her. The first time it happens, she is jolted, as though from an invisible hand, then smiles as wide as the sky before them. This new bliss of Emer's is so dense she manages to keep it for whole minutes, long dark nights, entire soft days, before she feels the sharp intrusion of fear, the coiling premonition of regret. Such elation, she thinks, must be what other people feel. Her sister, her son, Bridget, a group of married nuns. They must grow accustomed to it, and she imagines it is just as easy to be stolen by joy as by misery. She takes Bridget's hand on impulse. Usually they try not to touch in front of Niall. Bridget stops walking and turns to face her, pulling her hand in to hide it behind the flap of her jacket and pressing it promisingly against her warm thigh. Since their mouths can't meet, they lock eyes. Emer thinks she can see Bridget's pupil pulse in the exact rhythm of her aroused heart. Anam Cara, Emer whispers before she can stop herself. And though Bridget smiles and squeezes her palm, something trips in her gaze. The pupil misses a beat, and she looks away toward Niall and the pets. Emer must convince herself that it is only prudence that makes Bridget not echo this name. Thank you.
Thanks for reading that part. I was listening to you read and realizing that anybody who hasn't read the book won't get just how transformed Emer is during and by the relationship with Bridget, because she's really a pretty damaged person and finds it really difficult not to be furious and, I guess, kind of vindictive in her dealings with other people. Everybody except Niall, pretty much. But the relationship, or the sexual relationship in particular with Bridget, really changes her because, I mean, I love that line where you talk about her astonishment at the skill of her own body and her pleasure at seeing Bridget's pleasure, that she can have that effect on another person. And it's not so much that love or desire change her, but that she realizes she's capable of having a positive impact on another person, and that changes her, but nobody else really gets to see it.
No.
So it's, I mean, how did you find that part of Emer, having spent so much of the book, so much time with her in her really, angry, self-protective, bitter, I guess, state? How did you reach into her to find the little gem of, I guess, optimism? Because it's hard.
It is. I mean, I always knew it was there. Emer was easier for me to write than the other women, because even though she often did things that appalled me. When I first wrote the book, when I started it, she and Bridget were going to be friends, intense friends that then became enemies.
Frenemies?
Frenemies, yeah. And I was kind of basing it on those, those friendships that often women have, especially when they're younger, where they become obsessed with each other. And it's basically like everything, but sex. You love them, they break your heart and all of that. And that's where I was going. And then I was at McDowell writing, and they just, I hate it when people say characters do things without, because I made them do it, but they started having sex. And
that was McDowell's fault.
Yeah, it was. That was McDowell's fault. And I just thought, well, this seems to be working. I'm going to go with it, because it just made everything even more fraught with danger. And so the thing about Emer is that she was already in love with her sister's husband when they were all kids. And her sister gets the husband. And so she'd already had this unrequited, and still, she's married to his brother, who was like a shadow of him. Neither one of them was great, but, and she sees him all the time, and she sees her sister have this she's actually watched her sister have sex with her boyfriend, who was on her husband. She sees everyone else having these relationships that she can't have. And the thing about Emer is that she's not just unpleasant, she actually has like power, some magical power in her hands that is left over from when she was captured by the fairies, that she can, if she grabs someone, she can make them feel terrible. And for a long time, I think she really believed that was all she had. And except for her son, works on everyone except for her son, that's all she could do is make people feel really bad. And including her own husband, who, when they, have sex, it's like she's, he goes in complete depressive state and has to drink for weeks. So when I then decided to have them have sex, that was where I decided maybe she can actually, there's somebody else that she can touch, and it can make a difference. But and she can learn that she can have love. The problem is that even as soon as it starts, it's very similar to Tender. It's like, I think as the reader, I know because I wrote it, but that you realize it's not gonna work
It's not going to end
It's
well.
not going to end well, and it makes it look so much worse when when you see someone's hope, but you can see the whole thing, and you can see that Bridget doesn't need Emer as much as Bridget wants to have a baby, and she's on the island, and she's attracted to her, but that's not she's not there to find the love that saves her. And that's what Emer wants. So. I think I originally, when I thought of Emer, sometimes I say she's like the very worst part of my own mind. Like the way that, I imagine that Emer acts the way that I would act had I more freedom, like when I was in my worst possible mood. The thing that you think and you don't necessarily say when you hate everyone, when you're in a bad mood. Emer's like that all the time. And so I always had a lot of sympathy with her because I would just imagine myself feeling that way. You
could go there.
Yeah,
I mean,
I could go there.
A lot of the characters that I write come out of that same place or a similar place, where the things that go through my head, the uncharitable thoughts, the unsocial thoughts, the judgments, also the self-loathing, the self-criticism. It's useful to put them into a character rather than, for example, to unleash them on Twitter. But I think that, although that's happening all the time now, at the same time, it is tricky because it's hard not to lose patience with your own character as you write them, when they're a difficult, unlikable. Although it is a question as to whether a character can really truly be unlikable to its creator, when you know them so intimately and when you know that they come out of, well, not because you know that they come out of yourself, because we're not bound to like ourselves either, and most of us really don't, but because you can sympathize with how it came to be that way.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what's interesting about writing a really unlikable or difficult character, that you have a deep instinct for the inheritance and the baggage that made them that way. I mean, I described Emer as a damaged person, and I think Catherine is very damaged as well.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to spend most of the novel dwelling on her mean father or the inheritance of 20th century Ireland. It's funny, Lisa as I mentioned, she came to visit my class at Rutgers on Friday, and it's an Irish women writers class. I built it as a contemporary Irish women writers class, but that was kind of a trick because actually we start, with Mariah Edgeworth and move through Kate O'Brien, Maeve Brennan, Edna O'Brien, Mary Lavin. And at this stage, my students, who are all, early 20-something Americans, are just begging for release from the repression of
Then they got me, and they thought
mid-century
they would
Ireland.
be released,
I was like,
and they
got
weren't.
a new book, and their eyes lit up, and then it was just, oh my God, why is everybody so fucked up? But that's, for me, that's where the act of really seeing a character comes from, knowing what has happened to make them that way. But I suppose one of the challenges is that you can't make a lot of that visible on the surface of the book because it looks like it's info dumping or it's over-explaining or it's begging for sympathy for your character.
And I think that it is hard to have an unlikable character when you write them because you know more about them than any of your readers probably will, because you have to spend all that time figuring out why they are that way. And if you don't figure it out, then it's hard to make them that way. Do you know what I mean?
Well, for me, it's not so much about figuring it out. I tend to kind of, again, it's kind of instinct. You know the personal and the social circumstances that shape personality, and also especially relationships. The way that a person behaves in relation to others is inherited from parents, from authority figures, from what they see around them. And really, with I think with both Catherine and Emer, what we were writing were, codependent narcissists, who are made that way because of, I suppose, early stuff.
Yeah.
And that's fun, but it can be pretty draining. It is like the way you describe Emer's effect on other people. It strikes me as like a perfect metaphor for a toxic person, the kind of person who sucks energy out of everyone they touch.
Yeah. And it's funny because I thought that it was going to be difficult for readers to necessarily to sympathize with her, and I was fully prepared to have people say to me, Emer, she's relentless, and why could, and nobody so far has said that to me. No woman actually has said that to me. They've all said, I love Emer, I can completely understand where she's coming from. And that really surprised me because I thought some of them would.
Yeah, but she's been dealt a very hard hand in life. I mean, not just having the fairies take her away, which is hard for anybody, but her family of origin, her being a twin to a perfect sister, not being physically beautiful like her sister.
Yeah, but there are people who just there are those people who would say, just turn it around and
offer it up.
Yeah, offer it and become better than that. And those are the kind of people that I was afraid wouldn't like the character, but so far it has not happened. There have been a couple of men who've been like, I don't really like any of the, and I said, well, I'm sorry.
They don't like anything to do with any of the characters or any of the Emer aspects?
Mostly they didn't like Emer, and then they didn't like that that there wasn't maybe a man that they could latch onto that made them feel better. Because,
spoiler alert, there aren't very many men at the end of the novel.
And I think someone said, I think it would be better for women to read this book. And I was like, well, that's an opinion.
Because they might learn something.
Right.
About having sex with each other.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Women and the boys in your class.
That's right. Emer, I almost said. Lisa came to see my class on Friday, but on Tuesday we had the discussion of The Stolen Child. So that was the students talking about The Stolen Child. But two of them hadn't finished the book, the two boys in the class. And during the discussion of women bringing each other to orgasm, it became pretty clear that they intended to finish it by Friday. Sort of like, okay, you're definitely interested now. But I think they're still traumatized by Emer a little bit.
Oh, they were all traumatized.
So it's interesting to me that you say that you didn't think at the beginning of writing the book that Emer and Bridget would become lovers, because they have to be lovers.
I know. Now you think they have to be.
Why do you think that, and this is kind of a question about your writing process and how material comes to the surface for you and then ends up on the page. And don't just say because you're at McDowell, right? That's not a reason.
There were ghosts in that thing anyway.
But how do you think that it pushed its way from subconscious to conscious awareness that this was your plot, or was it like that?
I mean, I think that I didn't intend it, partly because if I had sat down and intended to write a book about two women in a relationship, I would have felt too self-conscious, and I would have thought, oh, what if I don't do it right? And what if, and so I just, in my mind, the obsession that occurs with young women falling in love with each other seemed enough when I started it. But then once I was writing them, and they were together, and there had all the history with Emer, who really, really wanted to experience sexual pleasure, but had no one to show it to her. And then all of a sudden, she's, with this. I didn't write this book in order, so I think I was at McDowell. I was concentrating on the present scenes where they meet each other and things like that. But I'd already knew Emer's past, but I didn't know Bridget's past really. And I think I just at some point, literally, I thought maybe they should just have sex here, and I didn't think that I would necessarily use it, and I just wrote it because it's just fun to write about sex. And then when I did, I was like, wow, I was such an idiot. Of course, it seemed to me, of course they would be together. Of course they would have. But in the beginning, I just thought their obsession could be, emotional. And so then I ended up backloading a lot of the past story of Bridget, and her history with women and girls, and and Emer's desire for a lover was already there. But then I wanted to have something, because she is 1959 in an Irish island, nobody, she probably didn't even realize you could have sex with at some point
with
in the
anybody.
book it says with anybody. Yeah. At some point in the book it says the only hint that she's ever had that women ever have sex with each other is that men seem to like to insult women by pretending, by saying things like, oh, you must, you're really obsessed with her, kind of thing. And that's her only clue that women ever had sex together, was that men thought it was something to make fun of.
Right, and in the book, that's that's a power play on the part of Austen, who eventually sort of takes takes things into his own hands as well. I mean, it's not something that he can observe or even be vaguely conscious of, that two women might be giving each other pleasure. He has to sort of step in and show her how it's done, which is really just awful. Not awful. It is a sex scene. I mean, they are making love, but there's such a sense of this is out of a kind of vengeance. This is not. I don't know. It's consensual, but emotionally it doesn't feel consensual.
Yeah,
in some way.
It's meant to be like a little bit of both. Like not, like yes, consensual, but then the kind of consensual where you realize some people, one or both of them realize when they're already in the situation that perhaps this wasn't a very good idea, and but then you can't go back.
Well, in an Irish novel as well, and I don't say this to be funny, but there's always so much alcohol involved in these scenes that really the conscious decisions of the characters can be quite difficult to account for. Really, and you know, in the first sex scene between Catherine and James, they've been at a party till 6 a.m. They've had like 5 bottles of wine each. And it's really important that they know what they're doing, that they know where the line is, but they can't possibly. No. Not just for alcohol reasons, but for emotional reasons. And, you know, those are, again, that's sort of a thorny little territory to have to write through, where you're really trying to make the emotional state of your character clear, but you also have to be true to the fact that it's very fogged by just, you know, having lost touch with reality about 4 hours ago in somebody's sitting room.
But also, I just love the way with Catherine and James, the way how hopeful she is, and how she is able to convince, despite the fact of being an extremely intelligent woman who knows him, but she has so much hope that she really thinks can't possibly be having sex with him if she doesn't feel the same way, even though all the clues are there. Which is what, you know, I think we have a bit in common with the books, is people who tell themselves things because to make themselves feel better, even though the evidence is right in front of them.
But I think that with Catherine and James, it's even darker, that kind of lying to oneself, than it is with, I mean, Emer and Bridget have an affair, you know? I mean, Catherine and James do too, but it's always understood for James that this is not a true connection. It's not a true connection of emotion, but it's also not a true connection of attraction and desire and lust. Whereas I think for Emer and Bridget, it is. For James and Catherine, it's something that happens because of the way they feel about sex, about what sex is allowed to be. I mean, Catherine believes, and this is where I really found her difficult to write, she believes that James must love her or must want to have sex with her because part of her believes that he shouldn't be gay.
Right.
Part of her is Mike Pence, you know? Yeah. Part of her thinks that eventually he's going to realize that he really wants to fuck a woman.
Yeah, and
you know?
I'm going to be that woman.
Yeah,
like, I could change his mind.
So that's a really, that's the part where it's much harder to sympathize with her, but then she feels that way because she's inherited all the crap that she grew up with and that her parents grew up with and that her grandparents grew up with. And that poison filters down through generations, so to the point where you get kids in 1990s Ireland still feeling, whether they're gay or whether they're the best friend of the person who's trying to come out, that really actually let's just hide for a little bit longer and let's just pretend that we're a couple, because that seems like the correct thing to do, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's what I mean. The feeling that I had reading Catherine is similar to what some people have told me reading Emer, which was even when she was doing things that I knew she shouldn't be doing, and that, you know, she goes a lot further than I would have imagined going. But I could also just sympathize with her because they were best friends, because she didn't have something like else in her. You know, it's like when you watch somebody doing something terrible, but you can also understand why they're doing it and what they're feeling. That's when you've written the character really well.
But it also goes back to knowing that we all hold uncharitable and selfish and narcissistic motives within ourselves, as well as the altruistic and socially responsible motives that we like to advertise. You know, that we are driven by whatever we became driven by age 2 when you know, our mother walked out of the shop and left us behind or whatever. So you set your book on an island, as did I, but my island's slightly bigger. It's called Ireland.
Yeah. An island off the island.
So did you, so for me, one of the things to account for and to try to write into the intimacy of their relationship without making it too heavily present was that kind of cultural inheritance, was the culture and the society within which the two characters were living. Mm-hmm. For you, with The Stolen Child being set on this tiny island off the coast of Ireland in the 1950s, how conscious did you have to be, or find yourself trying to be, of the cultural and social realities that these characters were inhabiting, apart from their private realities, which are so vivid?
Mm-hmm. I knew that the book was inspired by a documentary that you can actually watch on YouTube. It's called Death of an Island, and it was on an Irish television station. The island that I have spent a lot of time on when I was living in Ireland and still go back to is an island next to an island that was evacuated in 1960 because there were so few residents that, and they had no modern conveniences, and the government said, look, we'll give you houses on the mainland if you come off that island because it's too difficult to try to take care of you there. They had no telephone, they had no doctor, they had no priest, they had, nothing. If there were an emergency and during a storm, there was nothing they could do. So first I saw the documentary, and even though I'd sworn I would never write another book set on an island in Ireland because I'd already done that, I watched the documentary and thought, I have to write that book. But I interviewed some of the people that had lived on Inishark to find out kind of what life was like there. And it turns out that, if you on this island in 1960, it was a lot like, rural villages in Ireland earlier, because they were still doing all the same things that they used to.
From any kind of development.
Yes, except for the ones that either got away or went away and then came back. Like her sister, goes away to school and gets to go to goes to Dublin for her honeymoon and things like that, and brings. So I kind of was able to see that they were like living in the past, but there was the hope of something out there, which is part of the reason that Emer really wants to leave the island, because she thinks she's trapped in this place and that there's something else out there that is not this rural backward place that she's living in. So I read a lot about what it was like to be, I read a lot of those Irish island memoirs and things like that to get a feel for it. But I also have on the island that, so Inishbofin has better harbor, and it became a tourist attraction. But during this time in the 50s and 60s, it was about the same as the other island. It just had more people. They didn't have electricity, and they didn't have phone, and they had, and I know a lot of people that lived there at that time. So I talked to them mostly about what it was like and what it felt like to, and I actually know people that had come there from other lives in cities, and chose to go there because
I thought
it was
you were
so
talking
beautiful.
about fairies again.
No, yeah.
We're not from this place.
Yeah, no, so like people who, were used to living in the modern world and then decided to live on Inishbofin because it was so
Did you ask them about their sex lives? Did you ask them anything
no,
about
no.
desire or what it was like to be
No.
on an island and consumed by lust?
No. My imagination just did just fine with that. I figured I could figure that out myself.
Okay, so when I was working on this book, writing about the extent of Catherine's obsession and the depression that came with it was actually really depressing for me. It had, a sort of toxic effect on my emotional state. And there was a period where I just felt, this is normal for writing a novel, I think, anyway, but there was a period where I just felt as though I had kind of infected myself with her. And also because the novel is autobiographical to a large extent, although that's a kind of vexed question, because an awful lot of what happens in it didn't happen.
Right.
But it's like the spine or the I don't know, the tone or the atmosphere of the book is deeply autobiographical, but the material isn't, particularly because it turns out you need to do a lot with material to make it work as fiction.
Yeah.
But because I was sort of delving back into my own 19-year-old, state of depression and obsession and just behaving in a really unhealthy way, it felt as though the membrane between the past and the present had been ruptured, and I was back in that place for quite a while, for about a year actually. For you, writing about the intense emotion of not just their love affair, but the aftermath, which is so upsetting and traumatic for Emer, did you find yourself being drawn into that again? Not drawn into the emotional territory of that?
I don't know. At the time, it's funny because I wrote this book. This book was more difficult than any of my other books as far as the other ones I wrote in order, and I kind of knew what the structure was going to be. And this one, after taking time off, I just kind of wrote blindly whenever I had time. I didn't look back for fear of, because, a lot of what you write is horrible. And if you don't have much time and you spend that time writing, you don't want to look back at it and find out that it was a few pages of rubbish. So I think when I struggled with the structure of the book, and I struggled with the characters and their relationship and how I was going to. I wrote most of the book in pieces. Then I put it together and I intended to have a certain ending. And when I wrote the ending, it was a different ending, and it was not what I intended. And then I had to go back and fix the book so it fit the ending, and fix the relationship and all the things that happened so it would fit the new ending that I wanted. And so I was so sort of caught up in making the novel work as a plot and making the characters' desires fit the plot, that it wasn't until I was in later drafts and I was reading the whole thing that I realized how much of myself was in there, although just the same, none of this happened. None of these things that were happened to me. But I didn't realize until near the end how much of my own emotions of probably the last being a young mother, a mother of a young child, that I put into the book. And I didn't realize until I read it later. And what's funny is that when my husband read like an earlier draft, before I recognized some of the things, my husband tried to read an earlier draft, and he couldn't read it because he was kind of upset because he thought that I was writing about, things that are us, and he thought he was like maybe, the stuff about, when you have a young child and you're, kind of fighting with your husband a lot. He was like, "Would you think of me like that awful?" And I was like, "No, this is not about me. It's not about us." And then later, when I realized it still wasn't about him, but I realized how much of myself was in it. So it was like I wasn't upset while writing it, but then in the end, when I was doing the last couple of drafts, it was kind of upsetting to realize how much of myself I put in there, and how much of the island and the fact that they were trapped there reminded me of when you sometimes feel trapped as the mother of a young child, even if you absolutely love it and you love them and you would do anything for them. There are days, weeks sometimes, where you feel like you're in a storm on an island and you can't get away.
Did you also know that you wanted it to be a book about fertility and about a woman's body at a certain stage of her life where the possibility of motherhood may have flown without her quite keeping her eye on the ball?
Yeah.
Because it's really brilliant on that.
Well, I wanted it to be about all the different stories of motherhood. When you want to be a mother and you're able to have a baby. When you want to be a mother and you can't because of infertility problems. When you get pregnant and you don't want to be pregnant, and especially when you're living somewhere where that's really not an option. You don't have a choice. When you're pregnant and then you have a miscarriage. And so I wanted, to me, all of those things are related in there's a certain few years of a woman's life where all of those things come up. Either they all happen to you or they happen to you and your friends and your sister and all of that stuff. So I knew that pretty early on, I knew that that Rose was going to have a lot of children and love being a mother and want to have more, that Emer was going to feel in love with her child, but completely afraid and say, that's it, I don't want to do this again. I feel, I'll never get away if I have all of these children. And I knew that I wanted Bridget to not be, I knew that I wanted all those things, the three of them, to have different issues with motherhood and fertility. Right,
and just sort of stated like that, it sounds as though it could be quite deliberate or strained that all of these themes are present in the book, but it's not. I mean, it's really, it's something you discover as you read. These themes keep kind of pulsing through until about 2/3 of the way through the book, you realize that you're reading not just this story about the supernatural or not just this story about female desire, but a really sort of organic account of what it is like to be a woman in a body with a conflict about motherhood. You know, and you manage to sort of touch all of the, you know, the tender spots of that experience without it seeming like a project. I mean, that was one of the things I really admired about the book. The well in the middle of the island kind of feels like this womb space. And, you know, I mean, I've been struggling with all of this stuff over the last couple of years, so maybe I was extra attuned to it, but I don't think so. I think it was just something that you don't see written about enough, and you don't see it in fiction. And so I was surprised to find it in this story, which seemed to have so many other aspects already, and then to find it as such a true and, you know, attentive account of all
I'm
of
glad it worked, because to me it was always there, and I was always working on it. So you know, I would have been afraid that it was maybe got too heavy-handed at times. But to me, I mean, part of the reason I write novels is because I really enjoy all of the connections that you make in the world of your novel. And so I'm always looking to connect things with, you know, each other.
That can so easily become too busy, or like you're trying to rope too many ideas and too many themes and too many points into a book, you know, and we can all recite countless examples of books that have tried to do too much.
Yeah, and but I feel like you know when you're
the sort of the project is you do know when you're doing that, but it's very hard, you know, when you're in the middle of writing a book, you kind of lose objectivity on whether you know, and it's always tempting to drag in one more subplot to distract yourself.
Oh yeah, well that's what subplots are, I think. As well as, you know, past stories. And I think I always say that when I wrote my first book, I had 3 narrators because I was afraid I would get bored with one and then I wouldn't be able to keep writing. And then eventually it worked and I kept it, but it started out as a device to keep myself interested
I can understand
in the book.
That. Will we open it up to our lovely audience?
Hey. Yeah, Belinda, I was wondering if, like Lisa, you took your characters to a place where you didn't know they were going, or when you started writing the book, you had a sense of, these are my characters, and this is how they're going to evolve, and this is where they're going to end up. It seems like Lisa was more almost surprised by some of the things that happened as you were writing your characters.
Yeah, it was different for me because I, as I mentioned, the book is partly autobiographical, and I felt that I had a lot of material that I wanted to work with. And I wanted to find a way to turn that personal, lived experience into fiction. So for me, much of the discovery of the book was finding out how much of that wouldn't work as fiction. And that was, you know, very frustrating, but also sort of astonishing to me that I really felt as though this experience that I'd been through, and which had gone on for like 2 years, had the shape of a novel. You know, it's not as though I thought it was going to be easy, that it was just transcribing old journals or anything like that, although I did look at my old journals, which was a mistake. Don't ever do that.
No.
It wasn't as though I thought it was just going to be a matter of transcribing, but I thought it would play ball. You know, I thought it would become a story quite easily. And instead, it resisted me again and again. And what I found was that what had happened in life took too many twists and turns to be credible, but also to be interesting as fiction. And so I had to sort of feel my way through this sort of twin real and imagined material. So material that I felt I knew intensely, but that it was also unfamiliar to me because I had to invent it as I went along. And then I think, I can't really remember, because a lot of the side effects of that kind of depression that I described is that maybe like childbirth, I can't really remember what the immersion in the process felt like. But I know that what I came to be puzzled and scared about was how things were going to end, how I would actually make this into a story that had some sort of ending. Not a resolution, but that actually, you know, went somewhere in the end. Or were they just going to keep having guilty sex for the next 15 years, you know, and I'd still be like doing a sort of Knausgaard, 7 volumes, you know. So it was a battle with the shape of a story rather than with plot. Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me of, I have a question for you, but it's not about this book, it's about your other book. But you write in Solace about parenting a young child in a way that I thought for sure. I looked in the back and I was like, wait, does she have a kid? Because like, how many kids should she have? Because you seem to have an understanding of what it feels like to be the parent of a young child in moments that most parents don't describe to people who don't have children yet, because they're afraid that then they won't join us. I don't know, how do you know about that?
Well, because when my husband and I moved here to New York in 2005, it meant that we didn't have a place to live in Ireland anymore during the summer when we went to visit. So we ended up staying with family. And family all had, infants. So we'd stay in his family home in County Leitrim, and all of his brothers and sisters would come to visit at the same time and bring all their children with them. So I was sort of spending these summers in the house with, 5 or 6 kids under the age of 5, and really observing at really close quarters what it was like to be a parent.
But how did you know what was going on in their head?
Because
Did they tell you? Yeah, because you're a novelist. Okay, there.
No, it was just a matter of imagining.
Yeah,
And seeing frustration, seeing, my sister-in-law is the same age as me, and she had her kid very young, and just, we would sit up all night drinking, and then she'd have to get up with her infant, and I'd get up at 2 o'clock and watch her, and then go away and put her in a novel. It was very unfair, really.
It really was.
Any other questions for us?
Actually, for both of you, in writing about love and obsession and like the actual act, and sex and so on, is that something you're comfortable with? Do you look forward to it? Are you self-conscious? Is it an out-of-body experience? Or is it totally immersive? Because I know, those are sometimes the most challenging things to write, passages to write, and do it well.
Yeah. Do you want to take it?
You go.
Okay. I love writing about sex. I really do. And I didn't, in my first book, I was quite coy. There was a lot of beautiful metaphors, not beautiful metaphors, but ways of not quite talking about what was happening. But with Tender, I wanted to just write about what it feels like to be inside a body, to be in a body, and I suppose also to be inside a body, but to be in a body which is desirous, which is lusting, which is experiencing orgasm for the first time. Because Catherine's very young, and when she has sex with James, it's really the first time that she's had that kind of pleasure. I like writing about sex. I wouldn't read certain passages if my parents were in the room. Let's put it that way. But I don't really give a shit. I mean, we all have sex. We hope, if we're lucky, and it's strange to be self-conscious about that in life or on the page.
As a writer, you could do time dilation and
Time dilation?
You can describe it by a millisecond, or just sort of.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard not to be cringy as well when you're writing about sex. It's very difficult. I mean, that's probably the thing to talk about, is how you may enjoy doing it, but you may be terrible at it without realizing. And it's very exposing. I mean, if you're bad at writing sex, then there's nowhere to hide. So I suppose there's a prize. That's right. Although I think they're getting rid of that prize. Yeah. There is a bad sex prize in case anybody
they have
didn't
to keep
know.
that prize. I love that prize.
Yeah, and then if you're nominated for it, which thankfully neither of us have been, you have to kind of grin and make jokes and pretend that you're not horrifically insulted and traumatized.
You're finished writing the rest of your life.
So what about you?
I like writing about sex so much that I have to take out a lot of it, because my editors are like, oh, come on, Lisa. What did Arzu say? She's like, we don't want it to be that kind of book. And I was like, what kind of book do you mean? So I do enjoy writing about sex. And there is a lot of it that I would never, show anyone, because it can be cringeworthy. I had a teacher in graduate school, like an advisor, who worked on my first novel with me. And in retrospect, it was a little bit inappropriate and lecherous the way he helped me figure out my sex scenes, but he had very good advice, which was, if the sex is not particular to the character and to your book and doesn't tell you something, or keep the story going, then take it out. It doesn't need to be there, because there's a lot of sex in books out there, and you can read the same thing over and over. And he said, so if it's not, it has to be so good that it can't be cut out. And so he would send back scenes to me and say, write that sex scene again. And so I wrote them over and over and over again. And then that became a habit, and I just started writing a lot of them. So I think also part of it was the influence of my young reading, I think, because I grew up in a kind of Irish American Catholic family where no one talked about sex at all. And I think my mother managed to give me, she was also a nurse, so she was practical. So she like slid that, what was that book? Our Bodies, Ourselves. Like it showed up in my room. But I wasn't supposed to talk about it. So, so I read it. But so I read a lot of bodice ripping, romance novels that like at the time are really big in the 80s.
We talked about this the other day, and I said, that's not romance, that's erotica.
I know, yeah. So like they were really big in the 80s,
right.
And they were everywhere. They must still be now, but I don't read them anymore. So I read a lot of them, and I think I noticed when the sex was actually, when it was written well and when it wasn't. And I think that probably influenced me as a writer.
But also when I was working on Tender, some really good books writing about sex came out. I remember reading Catherine Angel's book, Unmastered, A Story of Desire, which came out in 2012 or 13, I think, and I was sort of midway with Tender at that stage. And it kind of, certain books in which particularly women writers were just not holding back, were not being in any way coy about talking about not just good sex, but bad sex. Really talking about awkward sex, talking about thwarted desire and thwarted arousal. Those books kind of gave me the gumption to do what I wanted to do with Tender, and not to feel the need to hide behind poetic description. And I really liked that piece of advice that your mentor gave you. I'm sure he was incredibly sleazy. Because
a little sleazy.
The thing is, sex shouldn't be generic in a piece of fiction. It should never be. You should never be leaning on the generic, descriptions, which we can probably all summon up from romance novels or whatever, or indeed from literary fiction. If it's true to that character's experience, then it's going to be particular. It's going to reflect. Again, it's going to reflect their neuroses. It's going to reflect their narcissism, altruism, balance. It's going to tell the way that we touch another person's body or allow ourselves to be touched, or want to be touched, says everything about who we are as people. So it needs to be particular to that person.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Oh, right, sorry.
Who wants to ask one more question?
Okay. Thanks.
Do you feel that having, a character who's obsessed, like since that's the topic, helps you? Does that drive you plot-wise? I mean, does it make it easier to have? Does that sort of design the plot by having someone who?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Or does it still happen?
It's a really good question. It does, I think, yeah, because a person who's obsessed is driven and determined, but also unreasonable. And so they drive the plot, but they also introduce all sorts of possibilities that a more rational character might preclude. So yeah, actually having a person in any heightened emotional state gives you more to play with as a novelist. Yeah. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, one of the first things they say when you're starting to write a novel is figure out what they want, what your character wants, and there has to be a lot of stakes behind it, or you fizzle out in the middle of the book. So automatically, when somebody is obsessed, you have a lot more to work with. The more they want, the more they want something, the more you have to work with. So.
But I think also the less likable they are as a character, the more interesting they are to write.
That's true.
The less obliging they are to the people around them, the more obliging they are to you as their creator.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.